Thanks for the intro, Sean, and welcome everybody. It's good to see you all, including some familiar faces from out of state. I'm really thrilled to be here and appreciate the invite from North Branch Nature Center. As Sean said, I work for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department in what's known as the Community Wildlife Program. And we do a lot of outreach throughout the state, and education is a big piece of what we do. So it's just really fitting to be here, if not in person, virtually with North Branch Nature Center, sharing some of the resources that we've developed that ultimately are really important for how our state goes about doing conservation work. So a caveat to the out-of-staters that we really will be focused on Vermont, but much of what you see here is relevant to the area that you're coming from. So during this talk, we're going to be looking at all kinds of maps and data, but I want to remind folks that behind every map and polygon and GIS shapefile, there's a real place. And many of these places are near and dear to the communities that we live in. These are the places we go to recharge, and right now we're learning just how important the natural world is to us when that's kind of the main place we can be safely right now. So if you're feeling overloaded by the maps, just look at the pretty pictures. Today we're going to just go through a couple introductions. I'll walk you through what Biofinder and Vermont Conservation Design are. I'll share some of the tools and widgets that we've built in for you to use and access this data. And then finally, I'll touch on some of the things you can do with Biofinder. So, it's not just a fancy map, it's something you can put to work in your community towards a variety of conservation projects. As I said, working for the department, our mission is the conservation of our fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. And that's a really broad mission. We're charged with conserving our natural communities, our fish, habitats, invertebrates, wildlife, and plants. There's all these wild living things that we are charged with protecting. And we do this by serving all Vermonters, from hunters and anglers to people who just like to look at wildlife from a distance. The program I work within is really focused on town and community level outreach, but we also have biologists on staff who are available to help provide direct assistance to landowners looking to improve habitat on their property. And we all take our mission really seriously. We get up every day and go to work to make sure that the wildlife and wild places around for us will still be here for our kids and our grandkids. And so one of the ways that we serve all of these different constituents is by sharing data and information that our department scientists have collected and created. Right now, we're doing a lot of online presentations, but in a normal world, we would be out in the communities in person, looking at maps with people, looking at conservation projects, connecting your community to the towns next door, and then creating and interpreting the wealth of data that's out there. And so, I really want to focus in on that sharing data that our scientists and partners make as a way to inform our decision making. We wanted to create a one-stop shop place for data on Vermont's biodiversity that would be accessible to all Vermonters. And that is how Biofinder, as we call it, came to be. And you might be wondering, okay, what is Biofinder? Well, first, it's a free online portal for information on Vermont's biodiversity. Second, it's a mapping tool that shows different ecological features at different scales. And it's the home for Vermont Conservation Design, which is a statewide data set of the most important ecological areas in the state. And you can get to it just by typing biofinder.vermont.gov into your internet browser, and that'll bring you to the website, and from there you're just one click away from actually getting into the free online portal. Briefly, I'll mention that this was a huge collaborative project involving all of these different organizations that I have up here on the screen, and we've been working at it for almost a decade now, and this Biofinder version that's live is actually the third iteration. So it's new and improved, and we're really excited to show people some of its best features. So as I said, it's a online portal. All you need is a computer and an internet connection, and you can access it from your couch, which is really nice. If you type that link in, it'll bring you to the homepage, as I said. And once you get into the portal, it'll look something like this, with this sort of menu of layers on the edge, and then a map visual here on the right. This image I have up isn't interactive, but the one you would have is. Second, as I said, this is a mapping tool. And so it's a way for you to explore places that you might be interested in. I was out paddling on a pond just this weekend that had a really cool cedar swamp that I wanted to learn more about. And so I went into Biofinder, found that pond, and sure enough, there was some data relating to that cedar swamp. It's also designed so that you can make your own map and pick out the data that's most relevant to you. You can print those maps off, and we're really hoping that people use this resource and share what they find with the people around them, whether that's family members, coworkers, or perhaps local town officials. And third, we've built Biofinder to be the home base for Vermont Conservation Design, which is this data set showing the most ecologically important lands and waters in Vermont. And the idea behind this data set is to locate the areas that give us a strategy for protecting, enhancing what we think of as ecological function into the future. And what I mean by ecological function is the ability of plants and animals to interact as needed in order to thrive, reproduce, migrate, and move, even while the climate changes. And so Vermont Conservation Design at its home is this set of different maps and datas, but it's also a roadmap for protecting these kinds of places. Again, as I said in the introduction, these maps all correspond to real places on the ground. And now at the department, Vermont Conservation Design is a big part of how we go about fulfilling our mission. Thinking back to that, we're entrusted with protecting all of the species in Vermont. And this image that I have up here shows a breakdown of how those species are divided up among the different taxonomic groups. In all, we estimate somewhere between 24 and 43,000 species live in Vermont. But the reality is we don't know a ton about many of these species, especially these invertebrates over here. In fact, our department has one zoologist who's charged with overseeing that whole massive project of invertebrate data. And so we just simply can't work one species at a time. We don't have enough money or people, and we needed a strategy to protect all of these different species, knowing that each one couldn't get the individual attention it needed. So Vermont Conservation Design is based on this idea of coarse filter method for conserving biological diversity. The idea behind that is that if you start by protecting a large habitat like this forest, you bring along most of the species that live in that forest, from the turtles to the birds to the plants and the insects. And if you do that for all of the other habitats, our wetlands and mountaintops, cliffs and rivers, you bring along most of the other species that live in those habitats and move between them. Vermont Conservation Design takes that strategic approach, applies it across the entire Vermont landscape, and by protecting examples of all the different kinds of habitats, keeping those habitats connected, we're pretty confident that we can protect most of the species out there. That said, there are some species that are always going to need some individual attention because of their specialized habitat needs or their unique life history. But this coarse filter method is our strategy for efficiently working on conservation. And so in Biofinder, you'll see a coarse filter strategy applied at 3 different scales. We start with the landscape scale. This is our coarsest filter. That'll catch most of the species. And then the next scale is the community level, which is a slightly less coarse or a more fine filter. This will catch more of those species that might slip through the cracks of a landscape scale protection effort. And then finally, as I said, some of these species just simply can't be conserved using a filter method. They need specialized individual attention. Okay, so I'll just pause here for a second, take a quick break. Sean, do we have any questions in the chat, or do people have any questions so far?
So far, so good, Andy. Feel free to forge ahead. If folks want to add anything as Andy's going, I will scoop that up and throw it at him.
Okay, thanks. So what does that all look like? When you go into Biofinder, the first thing you'll see is this overall Vermont conservation design priorities. And it's color-coded into a 2-tier system, this highest priority and a regular priority. And so here the darkest green are areas that we determined were highest priority. The lighter green are a regular priority. And the same is true for this blue kind of aquamarine. Those are highest priority elements, and then the kind of grayish blue are regular priority. Collectively, these are the places that maintain nature and all of its benefits. And what you're seeing here is landscape scale plus community scale plus species scale all combined together to show this network. Now, just to be clear that when we talk about conserving all of these places, we're talking about a good chunk of Vermont. In fact, 68% of this map of Vermont is highest priority. And so when we say we're going to conserve it, we're talking about all different kinds of land management, not just buying and conserving land. We're talking about smart forest management and a variety of other ways of stewarding ecological function on the landscape. These are also really important areas, not just for species, but for all of us and for human society. They filter our air and water. They protect us from floods. These areas are the basis for the outdoor economy in Vermont. And of course, they're beautiful, which is one of the great things about living here in the state or visiting the state. So when you get into Biofinder, what I encourage you to do, first thing, is just zoom into your community. And today I'm going to take you through Biofinder using the lens of my town, Montpelier, here in central Vermont. So zoom into your community and just look at the overall pattern. Here what I see is a lot of dark green focused around the river network that cuts through Vermont. After you've looked at the overall pattern, just start clicking around. And if you click on these different colored features on the map, this map tips box shows up. And a little green checkbox will show up for the various landscape scale filters that are present in that area. So this highlighted green polygon over here that I clicked on happens to have a highest priority area of these different layers. And we'll get into these in a minute. If I click on another area that's color coded, I'll see that in this case, what I clicked on was a vernal pool. So that's one of the ways that you can start to familiarize yourself with the different known parts of biological diversity around your community. The second thing, once you've done that, is I'd encourage you to zoom out and get a little bit more of a regional context of where you live. So here I'm zoomed out to about the central third of Vermont, and this red circle is around Montpelier. And the pattern that I see is Montpelier is really here on the eastern edge of a really critically important chunk of Vermont. And so that's useful context for understanding the role that our community and the decisions we make in our community play on the overall statewide network. So remember, these are real places. And today we're going to poke around in Hubbard Park, which is one of my favorite places to go jogging. It's an amazing place to watch the spring ephemerals emerge. We actually, Sean captured this saw-whet owl in Hubbard Park a couple years ago. And it's just an amazing resource for our community. So Hubbard Park is in an area that we call a habitat block. And by that, I mean an area of natural cover, 20 acres or larger, that is surrounded by roads, development, and agriculture. And in Biofinder, when I turn on the habitat blocks layer, what you'll see here, this is roughly where I live. And this big orange polygon here, that's about 840 acres, is the Hubbard Park habitat block. Keep in mind that this has nothing to do with land ownership. It's really just a map of different areas where there are chunks of natural land cover. And the Agency of Natural Resources undertook this mapping effort all across Vermont to locate these areas that had these features. And this is important to understand because this map analysis became the backbone for many of the other layers that you'll see in Biofinder. So this is the route I would take up into Hubbard Park from my house. And from there, I can kind of cruise around on this giant forest habitat block and poke around. So now that we've covered habitat blocks, let's get into the map layers that build on that concept. And we'll start with the landscape scale components. So in Biofinder, you'll see this menu of different map layers you can access. You'll need to turn off this overall priorities. That's the default one that comes on, and you can do that by just clicking on this little box. So the first layer that you'll see in there is what we call the interior forest block. And these are areas of contiguous forest that are unfragmented by roads, development, or agriculture. And we made this layer using a subset of those habitat blocks. So we started with several thousand habitat blocks mapped throughout the state, and then we winnowed it down to something like 1,200 interior forest blocks that provide a specific ecological function we wanted to protect, and that is that interior core forest, kind of like the deep dark woods. These are the parts of the forest that are buffered the most from the edge of the forest and you know, the impacts of land use around the edge of the forest. They're also really important for the ecosystem services they provide, such as air and water quality protection. And we know that these interior forests are going to be increasingly important as the climate changes and species begin to move. So going back to Montpelier and Hubbard Park, if I turn on the interior forest blocks, it shows up in this two-tone purple. So the darker purple are the highest priority, the lighter purple are just the regular priority. And interestingly enough, Hubbard Park doesn't make the cut to be a highest priority or even a priority interior forest block in Vermont. And the reason for that is that it's just under the size threshold that we used for this part of Vermont. It doesn't meet the criteria to be considered a interior forest block of statewide significance. Over here to the west, though, we have what did make the cut is this block here along the Montpelier and Middlesex town line. When we zoom out a little bit, this starts to make sense. So this Hubbard Park block is just here. at 800 acres, but this Middlesex block is part of something much bigger. And even further to the north is the Worcester Range and the Hunger Mountains, which are part of a much more significant interior forest block region. And so this is just why I encourage people to zoom in and zoom out. At the statewide level, Hubbard Park just isn't the highest priority, but at our local level, it's absolutely one of the most important forest blocks in our town. So just keep that in mind when you poke around in your community and notice which areas show up in the Vermont Conservation Design layers and which ones don't. Oh, so yeah, there's the Hubbard Park and there's Hunger Mountain. Okay, the next layer that you'll see in Biofinder is called the connectivity blocks. And these are forest blocks that together provide terrestrial connectivity at the regional scale. So here we're trying to move from chunks of forest to connected networks of forest that stretch across Vermont and connect into our neighboring states and Canadian provinces. For wildlife, this is especially important since many of our species need to move from one habitat area to the next. And by protecting that network, we're preserving the ability of these wildlife populations to exchange genes. And as I mentioned before, this climate resilience piece is especially important. As species shift their ranges, we need to create a pathway for them to move up into the higher elevations and further north. So going back to Biofinder, here I've still got the purple interior forest blocks. And when I turn on the connectivity blocks, you can start to see that they fill in much of the negative space between these interior forest blocks. And actually, I'll just point out that this Worcester Range block here is also mapped as a highest priority connectivity block. It just, you can't see the orange because it's masked by the purple on top of it. But in Biofinder, I could turn off this forest blocks and see just the orange by itself. So here you can see is a connectivity block that ties that Middlesex forest block up into the Worcester Range. And over here we have one of the most important connectivity blocks in the state. This is known as the Shutesville Hill Wildlife Corridor. And it's really the only remaining intact habitat between the Green Mountains here to the west and the Worcester Range here to the east. And so this is really neat. Many of the local players in this community have rallied around protecting this area, knowing that keeping connectivity from east to west here is important. It's a statewide priority. And we're really focused.
Quick question, if that's all right.
Yeah, go ahead.
What does it take to sever that connectivity? Is it a roadway? Is it 100-yard wide farm field? At what point is connectivity no longer considered intact?
That's a great question. It's really going to depend on the species. So some of our species really need tree cover, whether that's a forest pathway or along the edge of a river. Some species are willing to cross agricultural fields. And we actually have some really neat data that shows for some species such as bobcat, even just having a vegetated hedgerow is enough to get from one side of the road to the other. So it's really context specific, but the main thing that we're really encouraging is intact vegetation, natural vegetation, whether that's upland forest or a wetland or river corridor. But that said, an agricultural field is certainly better than a parking lot. Great question. And in this next slide, we'll look at kind of a more real landscape and see how that plays out. So this is an area in central Vermont. And if I color in all of the areas that would be considered a habitat block, you can see we have a pretty decent network here along the left of the image. There is this road here, but you know, some animals could get across in a variety of different ways. But there are also these other areas that by themselves don't really provide a ton of habitat value. But when you start to piece them together, they create these habitat connectors. So that like this small forest here, you know, it's not going to offer a species like bear hardly anything at all. But pieced together with the other blocks and connections, this might be an important travel corridor for a variety of species. And so much of the work that I do at the town level is helping towns examine their landscape, figure out where they have intact blocks, where they have connections, and if there are areas that are missing, there might be opportunities to restore some of that connectivity back on the landscape. And you know, the work that we do at the local level is magnified by what our neighbors do. And so in Vermont, when we turn on this connectivity blocks layer, what we're really going for is this multi-directional pathway of habitat through Vermont. We want a north to south corridor. We want an east to west corridor over here into the Adirondacks. And we also have, you know, a variety of pathways leading over to northern New Hampshire and Maine and into Quebec. And, you know, to give you a sense, this is just a map of forest cover and blocks. And you can really see that Vermont is at the crossroads in our New England landscape. So the work that we do here, you know, not to toot our own horn, but it's exceptionally important from a regional perspective. You know, for these species that come up out of Connecticut and Massachusetts, we're trying to make sure that they've got a pathway to get where they need to go. Okay, so those two layers really primarily deal with terrestrial or land-based features of the landscape. We also built a variety of layers in Vermont Conservation Design related to water. So there's one in there called the surface water and riparian areas. And by riparian, I just mean areas along the banks of rivers and streams and lakes and ponds that have natural vegetation. And these are really important wildlife corridors, but they also protect our communities from floodwater and sort of steward the quality of our water. So going back to Montpelier, you can see here that the river network plays a huge ecological role in our community. And much of the river itself here is this dark blue, which is our highest priority surface water riparian areas. And then some areas that aren't water itself, but part of the valley bottom or part of the river corridor are also included in the layer. And you know, if you zoom out, you can really start to get a sense for how the surface waters stitch together the Vermont landscape in a different way from the interior forest blocks and connectivity layers. So this is a different sort of filter we're using to protect a different set of species. We also have a neat layer in there called riparian wildlife connectivity. And this is a GIS model-based layer. We took that surface waters and riparian areas, and we realized that some of the places that were mapped didn't have natural vegetation. You know, we looked at the computer model and saw that some of them were developed areas. So we filtered out some of those areas that probably weren't providing as much value for wildlife and came up with this riparian wildlife connectivity layer. And this allows us to better protect some of those specialist species like mink and otter and beaver and wood turtle that really stick to those riparian corridors. I won't dive too much into what that looks like in Biofinder, but if you're into that, it's a cool layer to explore. And then finally, we built in a really fascinating and sophisticated data set based around physical landscape diversity and blocks. And this was built to capture the diversity of different bedrock, soils, elevations, and landforms that are associated with patterns of biodiversity in our plants and animals. And we know that some of our rarer physical landforms are places where you also find rare species. So there's been some really neat research suggesting that if we protect these more rare physical landscapes, we'll protect not only the current biological diversity, but perhaps the species assemblages that we might find in the future under a changing climate. So the idea here was, we're safeguarding future biodiversity by mapping these diverse landscapes. And if there are any geologists in the crowd, this is a fascinating topic to get into. Briefly, I'll show you what that looks like in Biofinder. It's my favorite color scheme with these hot pinks and yellows. And right here in Montpelier, you can see that we have some nearby rare physical landscapes. So these are, uncommon, not readily found in all places. The pink are our representative physical landscapes. These are sort of the more standard ones you'd find in Vermont. And then the yellow layers are what we call responsibility layers. And these are physical landscapes that are fairly common in Vermont, but are regionally significant and unusual. And so, as some of you probably know, Vermont has a lot of calcareous rich areas, which is somewhat unusual for New England. So, we have a responsibility to conserve those landscapes for regional conservation purposes, even if they're relatively common in our state. So those are collectively the different landscape level layers that you'll find. And I'll mention just briefly, I won't go into these tonight, that we have maps for all of these different community and species components, from our natural communities to our aquatic habitats, our rare species. We've also built a wildlife crossings layer in that some of you may find interesting. So all of these are available to explore and highlight different pieces of Vermont's biodiversity and what we know about it and where you can find it. So if I go into Biofinder and I turn on this community and species components layer, it'll open up a variety of those different data sets. And here in Montpelier, you can see a number of features show up. So this is a vernal pool that I've been watching up in Hubbard Park. And we have some rare or uncommon species up near my office building. So this is a great way to learn about the community and species scale components of biodiversity that are near you. And just to put it all together, this map I showed you earlier in the presentation is the lump sum of all those different layers mushed together and recolor coded. So it takes those landscape scale components, those are the greens, adds in the community and species scales, those are the blues and the turquoises, and gives us this map of overall priorities. So if you are in a rush and you just want the top dogs, the overall priorities of places in Vermont, you want to check out this overall priorities map. But if you're doing a deeper dive in your community, you probably want to get into this community and species scale. Or perhaps, you're focused on region in Vermont, a series of towns that have some shared goals. Landscape might be the scale for you there. Okay, I think we'll pause here. I see a couple more folks have joined us, and now's a good time for questions if there are any.
Andy, I'm not sure if you have the chat bar open on your side, but Allison's asking, is there a way to find information on why a landscape is determined to be rare? Meaning like what's actually growing there, or why a block is considered a good connector. And more broadly, this you know, when you're browsing around this map, it'll tell you why a particular area has been flagged, but it won't necessarily tell you that it was a bobcat or it was this rare, you know, type of flower or something like that. Is that true?
Yeah, so there is a resource, and I'll show you how to get to it, that for each layer we've created an abstract that tells you how the layer was built, what was included, and also importantly, what may have been excluded. So that kind of gets at how we built the layers and how we chose the priorities. And you know, much of this was based on a combination of research, but also expert opinion from a diversity of biologists and geologists and aquatic biologists. And you know, we cast a wide net to get as much expert opinion into this as we could. So yeah, we'll show you how to get to those abstracts. Great question.
And Sheila's asking, is this something that most states have, or is Vermont a pioneer with this?
Well, we are ahead of the curve. There are similar programs in our neighboring states. So Massachusetts has something called, I think Biomap 2 is where it's at right now. Maine has a similar program called Beginning with Habitat. But I do think that Vermont is ahead of the curve in terms of visioning what it would take to protect biological diversity into the future. Many of these other GIS-based programs are great at showing what's known, but perhaps are less synthesis-oriented than what we've done in Vermont. And I can't really speak out of the region. I'm sure many other states are involved in similar work.
Okay, thanks.
So that was a sort of surface level skim over these different layers. You can go kind of as deep as you want, and I'm happy to talk with folks more offline about that. But I wanted to go through some of the tools and widgets that are built into Biofinder that you may find useful. So the first thing I'll point out is this box over here on the right that says tools and has a screwdriver and wrench. If you click on that, it'll pop open this toolbar, and there are 7 different menus, and each one has anywhere from 3 to 10 different tools. So there's something like 30 different tools here that you can use. Well, one of the tools you may find of use is the identify and select. So this is going back to that theme of just clicking around. You don't need to worry about breaking it. But here, when you get into the identify toolbar menu, you have the option to select a point on the map, or you might choose to draw a rectangle or a polygon that would capture all of the map features within that. So here, for example, I clicked on this feature. Here I'm in the community and species scale components. And this highlighted feature is a northern white cedar swamp. And it tells me, just kind of what a natural community is, what type it was, and then here is the link to that component abstract that will explain how we chose which natural communities would be included in the map that you see. So that's a great way to learn more about the selection criteria we used. I apologize. This is a little bit small. There's another tool you can use called View Additional Details. So here I've clicked on a wetland, and in this box that pops up when I click on the wetland, there's a little blue text here you can click on, and that opens up another results pane over here that tells you more about the wetland in question. So in this case, I learn a little bit about its classification. Here in Vermont, our Class 2 wetlands have extra protections. I also can see that it is considered a highest priority Vermont Conservation Design feature. And that's just useful information for getting to know the features that you come across. Some of you may wish to use data from Biofinder in a different program. And so we've built in capabilities to get data out of the system. So I'll show you that here. I used the identify tool and I drew a rectangle around this area and captured one natural community and 12 different wetlands. And if I click on this little series of horizontal bars, oops, let me go back. It opens up this menu that gives me a variety of export options. So I could export those 13 different features to an Excel file, or I could export them to a shape file, which I could then bring into a variety of other software. There's also ways that you can share the data that you find. So in the Map Tools menu, you can hit this share button here to create a link, and it'll pin this location that you're looking at. So if I wanted to tell my buddy about a cool feature that I see on the landscape, I can share it, email him that link, and then whoever I email it to can get in and see what I have pulled up on the map.
Will it also pin open all of the different layers that you have selected?
It should, I believe, but we are working through some stuff. So if it's not, send me a message and I'll see what I can do. Another really neat tool is the print. This just allows you to make a nice map. So if you hit that, it brings you to this pre-formatted map and kind of shows you where in the state you are, which layers you have turned on. You can customize, add some notes of your own, and you should be able to change the title if you so desire. So that's a great way to just make a quick printout and share information that you've gathered about a place with somebody else. There's also a function to pull data out of Biofinder in a bigger batch form. If you click the toolbar, go to the map data, and then you'll see there are these 4 download arrows. And this allows you to download the GIS data for each of those scales, the landscape scale, the species and community scale, and then this other one, which I haven't really talked about, which is more focused on management targets. You can also download all of the abstracts and metadata there. So for whoever asked that question, you can get a big lump sum of all the different files and the abstracts for each layer. Okay, moving in, well, actually, maybe I'll pause here. Did anyone have questions about the different tools?
Maybe I'll get into this, but is there any sort of like tutorial videos or manuals or anything like that in addition to your position for people to be able to become more comfortable using the map?
Yeah, we do have some video recordings and some handouts. So I'll share what we have with Sean, and then you'll have it too. But if folks want to email me directly, I can send those that way too. I'll provide my email at the end of the presentation. Okay, so I'll plunge ahead here. This is just the last section. I wanted to share a few different ways that we are using Biofinder for real boots on the ground projects in Vermont. So the first way that I'm most involved in is at the town and regional land use planning level. We are using Biofinder to help towns write good town plans that will protect the natural resources around them. We also have a piece of legislation, Act 171, that now requires Vermont towns to plan for identifying habitat blocks and habitat connectors, and to plan for development in a way that protects them. And we also go into communities and help people identify features that are most important to them. And we call this our community values mapping. And Biofinder was built in part to support that kind of work. So if any of you on the line are interested in that, while we can't do it right now, we would love to do it when we're able to. Since Vermont is so forested, there's also a range of opportunities for people who manage their land for forest products. So many of those managed lands may have a forest management plan that's drawn up by a forester, and these are fabulous resources that give you all kinds of great information about the stands of different trees that are on your property and how to manage them. And Biofinder could add some great context to that. So here I'm just showing you two different maps. This is a forest management map here, and I have the same parcel pulled up in Biofinder. And what's kind of neat here is you can see that sections of this parcel are highest priority in Vermont conservation design. And then what you also see here is a large community and species scale component. In this case, I happen to know that it's a wetland. So that provides some useful context for thinking about how we want to protect ecological function at this parcel. We know that some areas are probably more important than others, and we know that our actions are related to the health of this wetland here to the southwest. Here's just another example. This is a landowner who drew up this map of their land and kind of zoned it off into different uses. So the green areas were the remaining forest, and the blue and the yellow were different agricultural zones of the farm lot. And that landowner could go into Biofinder and see which parts of their property provide the best ecological function according to Vermont conservation design. And what shows up here is this little stream network and farm pond that provides connectivity from north to south through this landscape. So that's useful information they could use to perhaps make a revised map of their property and think about how their management actions might impact ecological function. Oh yeah, so that's just the area of interest from my perspective. And you know, in the end, at the Community Wildlife Program, we know that it's a balancing act to balance a healthy ecology and a healthy economy and a healthy community. But the reality is these are all interrelated. And our hope is that Biofinder is a resource folks can use to identify areas that have extra value in their communities. And you know, Vermonters are always balancing different priorities, and you know, we're here to support that and acknowledge the challenge that comes with that balance. So as part of our outreach program, I'll briefly mention we did two related trainings this spring. One was more focused on land use planning for folks involved in conservation commissions and planning commissions and development review boards. We're doing our final session of that topic on Friday around mid-morning. So if you want to tune into that, contact me and I'll get you set up. And then we also did a training introducing Vermont conservation design for ecological consultants who play a big role in how projects are designed and carried out in Vermont. And that series is over, but if you're interested in watching the recording, I'd be happy to share that. And with that, I'll wrap it up. Here's my email address, andrew.wood@vermont.gov. And I'm always happy to answer questions and want to thank you for tuning in, and thanks again to the North Branch Nature Center.
Thanks very much, Andy. If folks want to continue asking some questions, now's a good time to throw them into the chat bar. I have a bunch for you, Andy. But Allison's asking thoughts on how she can use Biofinder with her high school students to help them learn about the landscapes near them.
That's a great question. I think there's a lot of different avenues. Sometimes I encourage people to pick a feature of the landscape that they're most passionate about. So for example, I really love to go swimming. So I'm kind of drawn to these maps of the different aquatic and riparian areas. And I think, you know, your students could divvy up the different layers and look at their community or look at the areas around their school and, you know, see what's there and think about what's within their ability to steward. But I mean, that's just a starting point. I'm sure you and your students will think of much more.
Eric is asking what software was used to create the maps. Was this mostly ArcGIS or was this something else?
These are mostly ArcGIS or related products. Some of the layers had multiple steps. So an analysis was done years ago and that was taken and refined and built upon. But, you know, it is sort of GIS oriented. But, you know, before GIS, people were mapping features all over the landscape. And so many of the records that we have from, you know, 100+ years ago have now been digitized into GIS, although they were certainly not created that way.
So I was hoping you could add some nuance to kind of a impression I had around Vermont conservation design, and you know, my understanding is that you know, the big picture question is, if we intend to conserve Vermont's biodiversity, conserve as many species as we can here on this landscape, what would it take? What land would it take to be able to do that? And is this, would it be fair to say that Vermont conservation design is like maybe the most parsimonious way of maximizing our biodiversity, or maintaining as much biodiversity possible with the land that we have?
I think that Vermont conservation design is a really good starting framework. And the reality is that, you know, Vermont is majority owned by private landowners. And so there's going to be a variety of different priorities and ways that those landowners may choose to interpret Vermont conservation design. Our hope is that people will focus on ecological integrity, and that could mean a lot of different things. So in some areas, active forest management is one of the ways that we maintain ecological integrity. You know, in an urban part of Vermont, the way we go about doing that is really different. And I think the Vermont conservation design shows us the areas that give you the most bang for your buck. It's not the end all and the be all, but I'll give you an example. We had a person on the line who works on river restoration and said, hey, how can we use Vermont conservation design to figure out where to restore rivers? And so they're coming at it from you know, restoring degraded areas to the point where they then begin to offer greater ecological function. In other areas, it's maintenance, right? But in other areas, we need to sort of rebuild where ecological integrity has been degraded. You know, it's not a one size fits all, and what conservation looks like is going to depend on where you are and what sort of time scale you're operating at. But yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and I'll be chewing on that one.
You know, as you were presenting here, Andy, I was scrolling around on Biofinder myself, looking into some of the areas that I've been spending a lot of time in the last couple of weeks. And one thing that that I'm wondering if you could address is and maybe I'm wrong, and this is just my impression is looking at the map just anecdotally here, but it seems like there's a high preference towards forested landscapes in particular, whether it be forested wetlands, interior forest blocks. You talked a lot about forests and that being a major determinant in something being kind of triggered as a high priority area. And I'm wondering, you know, if that and then just kind of looking across the landscape of what does light up in dark green and light green, right? And as highest priority areas or priority areas, you see a lot of forests, you see a lot of watersheds. What you don't see a lot of is fields and agricultural lands, although you just shared a kind of a great counterexample a minute ago. And I'm wondering what that means for things like butterflies that, who that do not exist really in the forest, except for a couple of examples. I'm thinking about like wood turtles that spend a lot of time in early successional habitats. I'm thinking about things like upland sandpipers and mourning warblers and bobolinks and other things that categorically do not use forests. And wondering how that's whether that's underrepresented at the kind of statewide, at the landscape scale. Obviously, it's accounted for a bit at the species level and at the community level. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so there is a series of map layers you'll see in Biofinder that's called the conservation targets, and these are management goals related to many of the habitats you were just referring to. So shrublands, grasslands, young early successional forests, all of these areas that we know are valuable wildlife habitat and plant habitat and insect habitat. So I think really what you'll see is when you turn on the conservation targets areas, it's going to light up a lot of the areas that may not necessarily be highlighted in the sort of forest waterway network. So, if you zoom into a field, what you may see is, hey, that field is a really great area for managing for shrubland or managing for grassland. And, the goal is we want to be doing those activities not in the middle of our best interior forest blocks. To some degree, forest management will create early successional habitat, and that's okay. We have our foresters who can help us figure out how to do that in a smart way. But we don't want to be putting grassland in the middle of Green Mountain National Forest. There are other places that are better suited for that, and I think your question kind of gets at the regional priorities are going to be really different. If you're in the Upper Valley or Addison County, you're probably going to be thinking about grasslands and shrublands, but also riparian networks. You might not have a whole lot of forest to work with, so conservation in that area is going to be focused on these components. Whereas if you're in Hancock in the middle of Green Mountain National Forest, there's a different set of objectives there. And, each town is not going to be involved in every piece of conserving biological diversity. The folks down in Bennington County have, lots of plant diversity that we just don't have up here in Washington County. So the priorities will be different. And I think that's actually exciting because people can plug in on what gets them motivated.
Andy, one last question from Erica. Is there any, do layers reflect the species diversity documented through projects such as iNaturalist or GBIF, which is the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, or I'll throw in eBird as well. Wondering if any of that is connected.
Not directly, but in some ways it can be. So some of our species occurrences that you might find in eBird could relate to rare or uncommon species that then could get uploaded into what's known as the Natural Heritage Database. And then the Natural Heritage Database pumps into the Vermont Conservation Design. So, it's not going to have, if you enter white pine in iNaturalist, chances are it'll never make it into Vermont Conservation Design because it's a really common, ubiquitous species here. But if you see an upland sandpiper and put that on eBird, people who are interested in that species are going to take note. And if it's a verified, reliable record, it may eventually become a part of what's in here. So yeah, keep plugging away at those citizen science programs, because someday you too could be part of Vermont Conservation Design.
Well, it is really just so, it's such a testament to how well connected Vermont is in particular, between, you know, state agencies and land trusts and nonprofits, and also, you know, citizens and amateurs, and just everybody that's out there just birding and submitting data to eBird iNaturalist. You know, that stuff is monitored very regularly, and a lot of the most exciting discoveries that have happened in the last couple of years have been things that have cropped up on iNaturalist that then immediately got the attention of the Natural Heritage Program and everyone else interested in the state.
Sean, will you share that story about the insect at the BioBlitz?
Oh yeah, so 2018 during our BioBlitz, a couple of our botanists, and so the BioBlitz used iNaturalist entirely as a way to document all of the species diversity that was encountered as people traversed Montpelier for an entire weekend. And some botanists took a picture of a random beetle on a kind of nettle plant, and not knowing what it was, they just uploaded it, walked away, and it turns out that was the first United States record of that beetle ever documented. And it was on a invasive plant, and back where that plant is native to, it has a kind of a specialist herbivore host insect, but that insect didn't make the journey over to the United States. And so so that record was kind of the first incidence of the host making the jump over the Atlantic Ocean and into the United States. So very, very curious. I'm thinking about another case a couple of years ago where there's a brand new dragonfly species never observed in the state of Vermont that was documented like 2 years ago by just a person who was out fly fishing and thought it looked cool and snapped a picture and put it on iNaturalist, and you know, brand new state record. And that happens with surprising regularity. As Andy, as you mentioned, like one of your first slides, there's so much, especially invertebrate diversity, that is just totally unknown still.
Yeah, and you know, this Vermont Conservation Design is a work in progress. We, you know, it's the culmination of many decades of work, and it's evolving, and we're looking at ways we can improve it. You know, we just rolled out version 3.0, so it might be a while until we get to version 4.0, but as the conservation science changes, we know that we're going to need to adapt. And, you know, as Sean said, we all can play a role in that, even if it's just getting out and exploring the areas outside our home. So.
Well, with that, Andy, I want to thank you for joining us this evening, for sharing your expertise, for doing the good work that you do here. Thanks for giving us a way to get in touch with you. I will take this recording and put it up online with all of the various links and resources that we discussed throughout this presentation here. And yeah, with that, everybody, thank you very much. Thanks for supporting North Branch Nature Center, and have a great rest of your evening and a great week ahead.